The kitchen of the Asante Boateng house on Nkrumah Avenue in Accra smelled at 6 in the morning of the things it had always smelled of at 6 in the morning. Groundnut oil warming slowly in the clay pot, the faint wood smoke that came in through the window from the neighbor's compound where they still cooked outside on certain days, the particular sweetness of overripe plantain that had been sitting on the counter since yesterday and that needed to be used today, and underneath all of it, the base note that was not any single ingredient, but was the accumulated presence of 40 years of meals prepared in this kitchen by the same pair of hands. If this story is already stirring something in your chest, take a moment right now to subscribe to this channel and drop a like. We are pushing toward 5,000 subscribers, and every single person who joins this family is the reason these stories get told. Now let us go back to the kitchen and to the woman in it. Her name was Rose Achiampong Darko. She was 48 years old, and she had worked in the Asante Boateng household for 14 years, not as a housekeeper in the formal sense of a title and a job description, but in the way that certain women worked in certain households, which was completely and without a clear boundary between what was required and what was simply what love looked like when it had been given a domestic address. She cooked and cleaned and managed the household calendar and accompanied Madame Josephine to her medical appointments and remembered which grandchild preferred which food and which day the generator fuel delivery came and where the spare key to the pantry was kept, and approximately 10,000 other details that kept a large house functioning with the specific smoothness that looked effortless from the outside and was, from the inside, the result of continuous, unglamorous, unresting attention. She was not tall. She had the compact, efficient build of a woman who had never had the luxury of moving slowly and whose body had arranged itself accordingly, economical in its motions, precise without waste. Her face held the particular quality of faces that have spent years being present for other people, attentive, readable, with a warmth that was not performed but had been produced over 14 years by genuine feeling for the person she worked for. Madame Josephine Asante Boateng was 80 years old. She had been born in Cape Coast, raised in Kumasi, married in Accra, widowed in Accra, and had spent the 4 years since her husband's death conducting her life in this house on Nkrumah Avenue with the specific, deliberate dignity of a woman who understood that how you lived in the years after a great loss was itself a statement about what the life before the loss had meant. She was a small woman whose smallness had increased with age in the way that the smallness of very old people increases, not frailty exactly, but a kind of distillation, as though the years had removed everything that was not essential, and what remained was concentrated and therefore more itself than it had ever been. She had a mind that was entirely intact and that she deployed with the precision of someone who had been using it seriously for 8 decades and had no intention of beginning to use it casually now. She had, Rose knew from 14 years of intimate proximity, a will that had outlasted every challenge it had encountered and that showed no signs of accommodation. She also had, and this was the thing that Rose had been watching with increasing concern for the past 6 months, 3 children whose relationship to their mother's existence had undergone a shift that Rose could track in specific, observable ways without being able to say exactly when the shift had begun. The 3 children were Margaret, the eldest, 56, who lived in East Legon and ran a catering business and called on Sundays with the regularity of someone meeting an obligation they had scheduled. Ernest, 53, who worked in banking and came on the first Saturday of every month with his wife Comfort, who sat in the parlor and smiled in a way that Rose had learned to read as the smile of a woman calculating. And Patrick, 49, the youngest, who lived in London and communicated primarily through voice messages that arrived at irregular intervals and that Madame Josephine listened to with the phone held in both hands and her eyes closed, the posture of a woman receiving something she needed even when it was insufficient. 6 months ago, the 3 children had begun visiting more frequently and not separately. They had begun arriving together, or 2 of them together, or one arriving shortly after another, which was not in itself alarming except that Rose, who had been in this household for 14 years and who understood its patterns the way a good gardener understood a garden, could feel that something had shifted in the purpose of the visits. They were warmer than they had been, more attentive. Margaret brought food when she came, which she had not done consistently before. Ernest sat with his mother for longer than the first Saturday of the month required. Patrick had called from London twice in 1 week, which in 14 years had not happened before. Madame Josephine received all of this warmth with the pleasure of a woman who loved her children, and with, Rose had noticed, a slight additional watchfulness. The watchfulness of a woman who understood that a sudden increase in warmth from people who had been at a reliable temperature for years was itself a form of information. Rose was stirring the groundnut oil and thinking about this watchfulness when she heard the car. It was early, just past 6:15, and the sound of a car on Nkrumah Avenue at this hour was not unusual, but the sound of a car stopping outside the Asante Boateng compound gate at 6:15 on a Tuesday morning was unusual because Tuesday was not a visiting day for any of the 3 children, and 6:15 was not a visiting hour for anyone. She turned the flame down under the pot and went to the kitchen window and looked out at the compound without moving the curtain, which was the way she looked at things when she did not want her looking to be observed. Margaret's car. She recognized it, the dark green saloon that Margaret drove herself because she said drivers made her nervous. It was parked outside the gate and Margaret was inside it, her phone at her ear, speaking with the animated specificity of someone conducting a conversation that had been in progress for some time and that was still in its important middle section. Rose watched. She could not hear the words. The kitchen window was not close enough to the gate for that, but she could see Margaret's face through the windscreen, and what she saw in it was not the face of a daughter arriving to visit her mother. It was the face of a woman in a meeting. Rose left the kitchen window and went through the side corridor to the pantry, whose small window was closer to the gate, and whose angle, if you stood at the far left of it behind the shelving, gave you the compound wall and the space just inside the gate where people stood when they came through and stopped to gather themselves before approaching the main house. She stood at the far left of the pantry window and waited. The gate opened at 6:22. Margaret came through, still on the phone, and stopped just inside the gate as Rose had anticipated, and Ernest came through behind her, which meant Ernest had been in the car too, which meant this was coordinated, which meant they had come together at 6:15 in the morning for a reason that had been planned rather than spontaneous. Margaret was speaking into the phone. At this distance, through the pantry window, with the morning still and the compound quiet, Rose could hear fragments. Not everything. Enough. She heard Margaret say, quite clearly, the words memory care facility, and then something lower that she could not catch, and then the words she cannot manage alone, and then Ernest's voice saying something that included the phrase power of attorney, and then Margaret again, and this time Rose heard it completely, heard it with the specific clarity that the still morning air and the angle of the pantry window and 14 years of paying attention in this house had combined to make possible. "If we move her before Patrick gets back from London," Margaret said into the phone, "the 2 of us can handle the signing. Patrick will agree once it is done. He always follows when the thing is already decided." A pause. She was listening. Then, "The accounts are the priority. The house can be handled through the estate framework once the power of attorney is in place. But the accounts first, the fixed deposits alone are significant." Ernest checked the last statement. Another pause. Then Margaret's voice, lower but carrying with the particular carrying quality of a voice that has dropped in volume but not in projection. "She will not fight it. She is 80 years old, and she is alone in that house, and she trusts us. We tell her it is for her safety, and she will believe it because she wants to believe it. That is what mothers do." Rose Akiampong Darko stood in the pantry of the house she had worked in for 14 years, behind the shelving, with the morning light coming through the small window and the smell of groundnut oil still on her hands from the pot she had left on the flame, and she heard those words and felt them land in her chest with the weight of something dropped from a great height. She is 80 years old, and she is alone in that house, and she trusts us. That is what mothers do. She thought about Madame Josephine. She thought about the way the old woman held her phone in both hands when Patrick called from London. She thought about 80 years of a life built carefully and honestly, and with the specific faithfulness of a woman who had loved her children without condition and who had trusted that love would be honored. She thought about a memory care facility and power of attorney and fixed deposits and an old woman being told it was for her safety. She turned away from the window. She went back to the kitchen. She turned the flame back up under the pot because the oil needed attending, and because Madame Josephine would be awake by 7 and would want her tea and her porridge, and her morning would need to be normal, entirely and completely normal, because Rose understood already, with the clarity of a woman who had spent 14 years paying close attention in this house, that the most important thing she could do in the next several days was to ensure that nothing looked different from the outside, while everything changed on the inside. She stirred the oil and thought about who she could call. She thought about what she knew and what she could prove, and what protecting Madame Josephine required from her specifically, from Rose Achimpong Darko, 48 years old, a household helper on Nkrumah Avenue in Accra, the woman who knew where the spare key to the pantry was kept, and approximately 10,000 other things that no one else in this family had ever bothered to know. She thought about all of it carefully, and with the unhurried attention of a woman who understood that what she was about to do needed to be right, not just good, not just well-intentioned, but right, precise and complete and sufficient for what the situation required. The groundnut oil warmed in the clay pot. The morning continued its arrival over Nkrumah Avenue. And Rose stirred and thought and planned with the quiet, faithful determination of a woman who had been underestimated her entire life, and who was this morning exactly the right person in exactly the right place, at exactly the right time. Madame Josephine came to the kitchen at 7:15, as she always did, in her house dress and her slippers and her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead in the way she wore them when she had been reading and had not yet decided whether she was finished. She moved through the kitchen with the particular economy of a woman who had navigated this space for 40 years and whose body remembered it without consulting her mind. The exact distance from the doorway to the counter, the precise height of the shelf where she kept her morning cup, the specific spot at the table that was hers and had always been hers, and that Rose never sat in even when Madame Josephine was elsewhere, out of the respect that certain spaces within households acquired over time. She sat at her spot, and Rose set the tea before her and the porridge beside it, and Madame Josephine wrapped both hands around the cup and looked out the kitchen window at the compound in the morning light, with the expression she always had at this hour, the expression of a woman conducting a private inventory, checking that the day had arrived as expected, and that the compound was as she had left it the night before, and that the world, in its immediate local form, was in order. Rose moved through the kitchen in her usual morning pattern, clearing the prep area, managing the second pot, wiping the counter, and watched Madame Josephine from the corner of her attention in the way she always watched her at this hour, monitoring the quality of her morning, reading the small signals that told her whether the night had been good or difficult, whether the joints were worse than yesterday, whether the old woman's mind was fully present or still arriving from sleep. This morning, Madame Josephine was fully present. Her eyes were clear, and her posture was the upright posture of a woman who had been raised to sit straight and who continued to sit straight at 80 as a matter of principle. She drank her tea in the unhurried way of someone whose relationship with the morning was one of the stable pleasures of her life. Rose had not yet decided how to begin. She had spent the hour between 6:15 and Madame Josephine's arrival thinking about this, about how a household helper told the woman she worked for that the woman's 2 eldest children had come to her gate at 6 in the morning and had spoken on a phone call about a memory care facility and power of attorney and fixed deposits and the window of time before the youngest child returned from London. She had thought about the words she would use and the order she would use them in and the face she would need to maintain while using them, because Madame Josephine's face when she received this information would require Rose to be entirely steady, which was a thing she had practiced across 14 years, but which this morning would require more of her than most mornings had. She was still deciding when Madame Josephine said, without looking up from her tea, "Margaret's car was outside the gate this morning." Rose went still at the counter. Then she resumed wiping, because stopping abruptly was its own kind of signal. "Yes, madam," she said. "I saw it." "Early," Madame Josephine said. "Very early for Margaret." "Yes, madam." A pause. Madame Josephine drank her tea. Then she said, in the same conversational tone, the tone that was not casual but was calibrated to receive rather than to direct, "Did you hear anything?" Rose set down the cloth. She turned from the counter and looked at Madame Josephine, and found Madame Josephine looking back at her with the clear, specific eyes of a woman who already knew the answer to the question she was asking, and was asking it not to receive information, but to open the door for information that the other person had been waiting to bring through. In 14 years, Rose had learned to recognize this quality in the old woman, this specific intelligence, the intelligence of someone who had been reading rooms and people for 8 decades, and who understood that the most useful questions were the ones that gave the other person permission to speak, rather than the ones that sought to extract. She came to the table. She sat in the chair across from Madame Josephine, not her chair, not her spot, but close, the close distance of a conversation that required proximity. She looked at the old woman, and the old woman looked back, and between them was 14 years of a relationship that had no clean category and did not need one. The relationship of 2 women who had spent more consecutive hours in the same spaces than most family members spent, and who had developed across those hours the specific mutual knowledge that proximity and time and genuine attention produced. Rose told her. She told her in the same careful sequence she had been rehearsing all morning, not leading with the most alarming elements, but building toward them, beginning with the observation of 6 months, the visits that had changed in quality, the warmth that had arrived with a new flavor, and then the car at the gate and the pantry window and what she had heard. She said the words memory care facility and power of attorney and fixed deposits in the same even voice she used for everything, because they deserved to be said clearly and without dramatization, because dramatization would have made them smaller by making them about Rose's reaction rather than about their own weight. Madame Josephine listened without moving. She held her teacup in both hands and listened, and her face did something that Rose had not seen it do before. Not in the way of something new, but in the way of something that had always been there and was now being called upon, a specific settling, a gathering of the self toward a center that was very old and very stable, and that the information arriving this morning was, apparently, insufficient to disturb. When Rose finished, the kitchen was quiet for a moment. The second pot bubbled gently on the stove. Outside, a bird was conducting its morning business in the compound's single tree, with the cheerful indifference of creatures unaware of human difficulty. Madame Josephine set down her teacup. She looked at her hands on the table, the hands of an 80-year-old woman, the rings on them, the specific geography of age across their surface, and she looked at them for a long moment with the expression of someone reading a document rather than examining a body part. Then she said, "How long have you known something was wrong?" Rose considered the question honestly, which was the only way she knew how to consider questions. 6 months, she said. The quality of the visits changed. I could not name what changed, but I could feel it. I felt it too, Madame Josephine said. She said it simply, without drama, without the performance of hurt. A mother always feels it. The question is whether what she feels is what she thinks it is, or whether love is distorting the picture. She looked at Rose. In this case, it was not distorting the picture. No, madam. Before Patrick comes back from London, Madame Josephine said, repeating the phrase Rose had reported, and in the repetition testing it, confirming it, making it real in her own voice. When does Patrick come back? He said in his last voice message, he would be back the first week of next month, Rose said. That is 3 weeks. 3 weeks, Madame Josephine said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, my husband, God rest him, used to say that the most dangerous thing in a family was not conflict. Conflict you could see and address. The most dangerous thing was the plan that moved quietly in the space between visits, in the language of care. Because care was the one thing you could not refuse without appearing ungrateful or paranoid, which meant it could be used as a delivery mechanism for almost anything. She looked at the window. He was a wise man. He was, madam, Rose said. What do we do? Madame Josephine looked at her directly. The question coming from Rose was the right question in the right direction. Not what do you want me to do, which would have been the question of a helper seeking instruction, but what do we do, which was the question of a partner in a shared situation, and Madame Josephine received it as what it was and answered it accordingly. First, she said, We eat breakfast. Because what comes next requires a clear head, and a clear head requires food, and I have been awake since 5, and I am hungry." Rose almost smiled. She rose and went to the stove and served the porridge and brought it to the table and sat back down, because Madame Josephine had not asked her to return to the counter, and the situation had moved beyond the counter. They ate together, which was not something that happened often, and which was not remarked upon by either of them, because some mornings rearranged the ordinary furniture of a household without needing to announce the rearrangement. While they ate, Madame Josephine thought aloud in the specific way she thought aloud when she was working through something serious, not continuously, but in punctuated observations separated by silence, each one a step in a sequence that she was building as she spoke. She said that the power of attorney was the critical instrument, because without it, her children could make plans but could not execute them. Her signature on that document was the hinge on which everything else turned, and her signature was hers to give or withhold. She said that the accounts were in her name alone, which meant that no transaction could be authorized without her direct involvement or a valid power of attorney, which returned her to the same point. She said that the house was in her name, and had been in her name since the title was transferred from the joint names she and her husband had held it under, which he had insisted on before he died. His specific, final insistence, conducted from a hospital bed with his affairs, in the order that deliberate men put their affairs in when they understand that order will be needed. She said all of this between spoonfuls of porridge, in the tone of a woman conducting an inventory, which was what it was. The inventory of an 80-year-old woman assessing what she had and what protected it and what the gaps were. Then she set down her spoon and looked at Rose and said, "I need a lawyer, not the family lawyer. The family lawyer has known Margaret and Ernest since they were children, and his loyalty is distributed in ways I cannot fully trust tonight. I need someone new, someone who is mine alone." Rose looked at her employer across the kitchen table in the morning light of a Tuesday that had begun as an ordinary Tuesday and had become something else entirely. And she thought about who she knew, about the specific network of connections that 14 years of working in a household in Accra had built around her, the web of other helpers and other households, and the information that moved through that web with the quiet efficiency of information that moved between people who were invisible to the powerful, and therefore heard things the powerful did not know were being heard. She thought about a name. "There is a woman," Rose said slowly. "Her name is Gloria Asare Mensah. She is a lawyer in Lebone. Her sister works in the household of the family 2 streets over, and she has spoken of her. She handles matters for elderly clients specifically. She is known for it. She is known for being on the right side." Madame Josephine looked at her. "You trust this information?" "I trust the person who gave it to me," Rose said. "She has never given me a reason not to." Madame Josephine nodded once, the nod of a woman making a decision and moving on from the making of it. "Call her this morning," she said, "from your personal phone. Tell her that Madame Josephine Asante Boateng on Nkrumah Avenue needs to see her today if possible, and tomorrow at the latest, and that the matter is urgent and private, and that she should come to the house and not to any office where the name Asante Boateng might be recognized by someone who should not recognize it yet." She stood from the table with the deliberateness of a woman rising for a purpose rather than simply rising. She picked up her teacup. She looked at Rose with an expression that held several things: gratitude, resolve, the specific warmth of a woman acknowledging that the person across from her had done something significant, and she said in a voice that was quiet and entirely certain, 14 years, Rose. 14 years you have been in this house. Do you know what I have understood in that time?" Rose looked at her. "That the people who love you most are not always the ones who share your name," Madame Josephine said. She carried her cup to the sink and rinsed it herself and set it on the drying rack and went toward her bedroom to dress. And Rose sat at the kitchen table in the morning light and felt the words settle into her chest and stay there, warm and permanent, the way true things stayed when they were finally said out loud. Are you watching this from Accra, Lagos, London, Toronto, Nairobi, or somewhere else in this world? Drop your location in the comments right now and hit that like button. We are so close to 5,000 subscribers, and every comment, every like, every share is what keeps these stories alive for the people who need them most. Gloria Asare Mensah arrived at the house on Nkrumah Avenue at 3 o'clock in the afternoon in a modest silver car that she parked outside the compound gate without fanfare and without the particular announcement that certain professionals made of their arrivals. She was 44 years old, medium height, with the kind of face that people trusted before they knew why they trusted it. Open, attentive, with eyes that moved quickly and settled completely when they found what they were looking at. The eyes of someone who had trained herself to be fully present in rooms that required it. She wore a plain, dark dress and carried a leather bag that was not new and was not trying to be. And she came through the compound gate that Rose opened for her with the unhurried composure of someone who had been in many houses at many delicate moments and understood that how you entered mattered as much as what you did once you were inside. Rose had spoken with her at 9:15 that morning from her personal phone in the pantry with the door closed, using the language Madame Josephine had specified. Urgent, private, today, if possible. Gloria had asked 3 questions, each one precise and placed with the accuracy of someone identifying the essential shape of a situation before committing to engagement. She had asked whether the client was mentally competent and capable of instructing her directly. She had asked whether any legal instruments had already been signed. She had asked whether there was immediate physical risk to the client. The answers were yes, no, and not yet, and Gloria had said she would be there at 3. Rose brought her to the sitting room where Madame Josephine was waiting in her good chair, not the hospital chair, not the television chair, but the high-backed chair by the window that she sat in for conversations she considered serious, which communicated to anyone who knew her that she had already assessed this conversation as serious and had arranged herself accordingly. She was dressed properly. Not formally, she was not performing occasion, but with the specific attention to presentation of a woman who understood that how you appeared when you were asking for help determined, in part, the quality of help you received. Gloria greeted her with both hands and the slight, respectful inclination of the head that younger Ghanaian women offered to older ones, and which Madame Josephine received with the quiet acknowledgement of someone who noticed such things and considered them meaningful. They sat. Rose brought water and then withdrew to the doorway, which was the position Madame Josephine had designated for her, present enough to be part of the consultation if needed, discreet enough not to impose herself on it. Gloria opened her leather bag and took out a notepad and a pen and set them on the table and looked at Madame Josephine and said simply, "Tell me everything, from the beginning, in your own time," Madame Josephine told her. She told her with the organized precision of a woman who had been thinking about how to tell it since 7:15 that morning and who had arranged the telling in her mind across the hours between breakfast and 3 o'clock into the sequence that a lawyer would find most useful. She told her about the 6 months of changing visits, the new warmth with its new flavor. She told her about the car at the gate and what Rose had heard. She told her about the power of attorney and the accounts and the house and Patrick in London and the 3-week window. She told her about her husband's arrangements before his death, the title transfer, the deliberate final ordering of his affairs. And she told her about the family lawyer whose distributed loyalties she did not fully trust. She told all of it without tears and without the performance of distress and without any apparent requirement for sympathy, which was not because she did not feel anything. Rose, watching from the doorway, could see the specific quality of controlled feeling in the old woman's face, the effort of a woman holding herself steady across difficult terrain. But because she had decided that this conversation required information rather than emotion, and she had characteristically provided what the situation required, Gloria listened without interrupting. She wrote in her notepad in a small, quick hand, not transcribing but noting the significant points, the specific details, the dates and the names and the numbers. When Madame Josephine finished, Gloria looked at her notes for a moment and then looked up. "The accounts," she said. "The fixed deposits, specifically. Are they in your name alone or in a joint name?" "My name alone. My husband transferred them to my sole name in 2019, a year before he died. He was very deliberate about it. And the house title is in your sole name. Since 2020, he saw to it himself from the hospital. He was protecting you," Gloria said. It was not a question. "He was protecting what he had built," Madame Josephine said. He understood that the vulnerability was not financial. The vulnerability was always going to be the document, the signature. Gloria nodded. She wrote, "No power of attorney has been signed. None. And no one has asked you directly to sign one. Not yet. I believe the plan was to approach me this week, possibly this weekend, when both Margaret and Ernest would be present together." "Then we have a window," Gloria said. She sat back slightly and looked at her notepad, and then at Madame Josephine with the specific expression of a lawyer who has received a situation and has identified its structure. "What I am going to do today," she said, "is prepare 2 documents. The first is a formal letter of instruction from you to me, establishing me as your personal legal representative in all matters relating to your property, your accounts, and your personal welfare. This letter, once signed, means that any approach to any institution, any bank, any property registry, any care facility, on your behalf must be coordinated through my office. It does not prevent your children from approaching you directly, but it creates a professional layer of protection around every institution they might try to access without your knowledge." She paused. "The second document is a formal statement of your wishes regarding your living situation, your medical care, and the disposition of your property. It is not a will. Your will can be reviewed separately, but it is a witnessed, dated document in your own words that establishes clearly and on record that you are mentally competent, that you are living in your home by choice, that you have not expressed any wish to move to a residential facility, and that any representation to the contrary is false." Madame Josephine looked at the lawyer across the sitting room with the expression of a woman receiving exactly what she had needed and had not known precisely how to ask for. "How long will this take to prepare?" "I have the templates on my laptop. With your instructions, I can have both documents ready for signature before I leave this afternoon." "Then let us begin," Madame Josephine said. They worked for 2 hours. Gloria asked questions and typed, and Madame Josephine answered with the focused, unhurried precision that had always characterized her thinking. And Rose moved between the sitting room and the kitchen, bringing tea and water, and the occasional biscuit that Madame Josephine did not ask for, but that Rose brought anyway because the work was serious, and serious work required sustenance. At 5:15, Gloria printed the documents on the small printer she had brought in her bag. Rose had not noticed it initially, but it was there, the specific preparation of a lawyer who had learned to be self-sufficient in the homes of clients who needed discretion, and laid them on the table between herself and Madame Josephine, and walked through them paragraph by paragraph, reading aloud and explaining and confirming until Madame Josephine said at each section, "Yes, that is correct. That is what I want, that is what I mean," with the clarity of a woman who knew her own mind and was not afraid to confirm it. Then Madame Josephine signed. She signed both documents in her clear, deliberate signature, the signature of a woman who had been signing important things for 60 years and who understood that her name on paper was not a formality but a statement. And Gloria witnessed the signatures and dated them and signed beside them and put them in a sealed envelope that she marked with the date and her firm's details and placed in her bag. "I will register the letter of instruction with the Law Society today," she said. "By tomorrow morning it will be on record. Any lawyer your children consult about your affairs will encounter it immediately." She paused. She looked at Madame Josephine with the direct personal gaze that she had been maintaining the professional register separate from across the past 2 hours, and which she now briefly allowed to be simply one person looking at another. "There is one more thing I want to raise," she said, "and I raise it as a suggestion, not a legal requirement. Your son, Patrick, in London." Madame Josephine was still. "He does not know what is being planned," Gloria said. "He was not at the gate this morning. He was not on the call, and according to what you have told me, the plan specifically accounts for moving before he returns." "Yes," Madame Josephine said. "Then he needs to know," Gloria said. "Not everything. Not in a way that creates a family crisis that overwhelms what we are trying to protect. But he needs to know enough to be an informed party. Because if what we have done today is a structure, Patrick is a wall of that structure. His presence and his knowledge makes the structure complete." Madame Josephine looked at the window. The Accra afternoon light was doing its late-day thing, warm and golden and slightly dusty, the light that made even difficult days look from the outside like something that could be survived. She thought about Patrick's voice messages, the phone held in both hands, the eyes closed. She thought about her youngest son, who had not been in the car at the gate and had not been on the call and who was in London unknowing, the gap in the wall that the plan had been designed to exploit. "I will call him tonight," she said. "Good," Gloria said. She stood and extended her hand. Madame Josephine took it and held it for a moment rather than shaking it, which was an elder's gesture and which Gloria received with the stillness of someone understanding that they were being thanked in a language older than words. Rose showed Gloria to the gate. On the way through the compound, Gloria stopped and looked at the house, the main house on Nkrumah Avenue, its 40 years visible in its walls and its windows, and the specific settled quality of a building that had been genuinely lived in, and said to Rose without turning, "You did the right thing this morning. You did it at personal risk to your position, and you did it anyway." Rose looked at the house alongside the lawyer. "She is not just my employer," Rose said. Gloria looked at her. "No," she said, "I can see that." She went through the gate. Rose closed it behind her and stood in the compound in the late afternoon light and felt the day settle around her. The morning and the pantry window and the ground nut oil and the kitchen table and the 14 years and the sitting room and the 2 signed documents in the sealed envelope in a lawyer's bag, all of it settling into the specific shape of a day that had been, from its first difficult moment, exactly what it needed to be. Patrick Asante Boateng received his mother's call at 9:45 in the evening London time, which was 10:45 in Accra, and he received it the way he received all his mother's calls, with both hands on the phone and his full attention, which was the specific quality of attention that people gave to things they understood were not permanent and whose impermanence they had registered deeply enough to stop taking the thing for granted. He was 49 years old, and he lived in Peckham in a flat that was small and organized with the precision of a man who had learned that in a small space, clarity was not optional but structural. And he was sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold beside his laptop when the phone rang with the Accra code and his mother's name on the screen. He answered on the second ring. Madame Josephine spoke for 20 minutes. She spoke in the same organized, unhurried way she had spoken to Gloria that afternoon, beginning not with the most alarming elements, but with the context, the 6 months of observations, the changing quality of the visits, and then the car at the gate, and what Rose had heard, and the lawyer and the 2 signed documents, and what all of it meant, and what she needed from him. Patrick listened. He listened in the particular way that people listened to their mothers when their mothers were saying something serious. With the full body, not just the ears, the kind of listening that was also a kind of holding. The person on one end of the line held by the attention of the person on the other. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Outside his Peckham window, the London night was conducting its business. A bus going past, 2 voices on the pavement below, the distant sound of something that might have been music. He looked at his cold tea. He thought about Margaret's voice as his mother had reported it, the specific flatness of the phrase "that is what mothers do," and felt something move through him that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but was the thing that lived in between those 2 conditions when both of them were present simultaneously and neither had yet resolved into the other. She said, "Before Patrick gets back," he said, not a question. A repetition of a fact he was making real by saying aloud. "Yes," his mother said. "She said it on the phone." Rose heard it clearly. He pressed 2 fingers against his closed eyes for a moment. Then he removed them and looked at the London night through his window and said, in a voice that had found its steadiness, "I am coming home. Patrick, not in 3 weeks. I am coming home this week. I will change my ticket tomorrow morning." Madame Josephine was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in the voice she used when she had already considered the thing being proposed and had reached a conclusion about it, "Come on Friday, not before. If you come before Friday, it will be noticed, and it will change what Margaret and Ernest are planning before Gloria has finished preparing what needs to be prepared. Come on Friday and come quietly and come directly to the house." He understood. The plan that had been designed to use his absence as a tool could be inverted. His presence, arriving at the right moment rather than the premature one, was itself a counter-move. He said he would be there on Friday. He said it and meant it with the specific, grounded certainty of a man who has spent years receiving insufficient information about a situation and has finally received the full picture and knows exactly what it requires of him. He said goodnight to his mother, and she said goodnight to him, and then, before she hung up, she said, "In twi," the phrase she had used at the end of every phone call since he was a child studying in Cape Coast, the phrase that meant, essentially, "I am holding you even from here." And he received it, as he had always received it, completely. As a child receives the things their parents have been giving them so long, they have become part of the architecture of who they are. He sat at his kitchen table for a long time after the call ended. He thought about his mother in the house on Nkrumah Avenue that he had grown up in, the specific smell of it, the kitchen and the compound, and the single tree that had been there since before he was born. He thought about Rose, whom he had known for 14 years and who had stood at a pantry window at 6:15 in the morning and had heard what she heard and had not walked away from it, which was not a small thing, and which he intended to acknowledge properly when he saw her on Friday. He thought about his father, who had arranged the title and the accounts in his mother's sole name from a hospital bed with the deliberate protective intelligence of a man who had seen how families collapsed after a death and had done what he could to prevent it. He thought about Margaret and Ernest, his siblings, his actual siblings, the people he had grown up alongside and fought with and reconciled with and loved in the complicated, persistent way that siblings loved each other through everything. And he felt, in thinking of them, the specific sorrow of someone discovering that the people they loved were capable of something the love had not prepared them to believe. In Accra, Rose was in the kitchen at 11 at night, washing the dinner things, when Madame Josephine came in. She came in quietly, in her night wrapper, and sat at the kitchen table in her spot, and said nothing immediately, which was the way she came to the kitchen when she wanted company rather than conversation, and Rose understood this and continued washing, and did not speak, and let the quiet of the late kitchen be what it was. After a while, Madame Josephine said, "He is coming on Friday." "Mr. Patrick?" "Yes, I told him to wait until Friday. Gloria needs the time." "He agreed?" "Patrick has always been the one who listened," Madame Josephine said. There was something in how she said it, not a comparison, not a judgment on the others, but a simple observation about her youngest son's specific nature that had been consistent across 49 years and that she was noting tonight with the particular tenderness of a woman who had just been reminded of it. On Wednesday, Margaret came. She came alone at 2 in the afternoon with a container of food that she had cooked herself, groundnut soup, rice, fried plantain, and she sat with her mother in the sitting room and was warm and attentive and asked about her health and her sleep and whether the compound security light that had been flickering had been repaired, and Madame Josephine received all of it with the warmth she had always shown her daughter, and with, underneath that warmth, the specific watchful attention of a woman who was now reading a different text than she had been reading 6 months ago, the text underneath the warmth, the text that had been written in a car at a gate at 6:15 on a Tuesday morning. Rose served the food and moved through the sitting room and the corridor and the kitchen in her ordinary way. And when Margaret spoke to her, she always spoke to Rose pleasantly, which Rose received pleasantly and without additional investment. Rose responded as she always responded and gave nothing in her face or her manner that was different from any other Wednesday afternoon. After the food, after the warmth, in the particular shifting of gears that Rose had learned to recognize as the moment when a visit moved from its social portion to its purposeful portion, Margaret said, with the specific lightness of someone introducing a heavy topic, "Mama, Ernest and I have been thinking about you, about your situation here." Madame Josephine looked at her daughter. "My situation," she said. "Being alone," Margaret said, "in this big house, at your age. We worry." "You worry," Madame Josephine said. The repetition was neutral. It gave Margaret nothing and took nothing away. "There are places," Margaret said, and her voice had the rehearsed quality of someone delivering a prepared section of a longer presentation. "Wonderful places, well-staffed, with medical support and social programs and other people your age. Communities, really, where you would not be alone and where we would not need to worry about you in the way we worry now." She paused. "We visited one last week." Ernest and I. It is in cantonments. Beautiful grounds, Mama. The rooms are large and the staff they are wonderful, attentive. We thought perhaps you would like to visit, just to see." Madame Josephine looked at her daughter for a long moment. In the corridor, Rose stood with a folded cloth in her hands and listened to the silence that followed Margaret's prepared presentation, and understood that the silence was itself Madame Josephine's response. The first part of it, the part that preceded words and that communicated, to anyone capable of reading it, that what had just been said had been received by someone who was not receiving it in the way it had been designed to be received. "Margaret," Madame Josephine said. Her voice was gentle and entirely without performance. "Do you remember what your father said at his last Christmas? The last one he was well enough to sit at the table for?" Margaret looked slightly uncertain, which was the natural response to a conversation being redirected by a question that came from an unexpected direction. "He said many things," she said carefully. "He said," Madame Josephine continued, "that the house on Nkrumah Avenue would stand for as long as a member of this family needed it to stand, and that the first duty of every person in this family was to protect the person who needed protecting most. He said it at the table with all of you present." She paused. "I remember it very clearly. I have been thinking about it this week." Margaret said nothing. The sitting room was very quiet. Rose tightened her hands slightly on the folded cloth in the corridor and waited. "I am not going to cantonments," Madame Josephine said. She said it simply, without drama, without the elevation of volume that people used when they wanted to communicate finality. She said it the way she said everything important, at the same level, with the same steadiness, which was itself the finality. "I am going to stay in this house. I am going to stay in this house because it is my house, and because your father built it for me, and because I am 80 years old, and I am in my right mind, and I am happy here." She looked at her daughter. "Is there something else you wanted to discuss?" Margaret opened her mouth. She closed it. She looked at her mother's face and found in it the thing that had always been in it, the clarity, the settled intelligence, the complete absence of the confusion and fragility that the plan had been predicated on. And she found, in finding it, that the prepared sections of the longer presentation had nowhere to go. Subscribe to this channel right now and hit that like button. We are so close to 5,000 subscribers, and every single person who subscribes keeps these stories reaching the people who need them. Are you watching from Accra, Lagos, London, New York, Nairobi, or somewhere else in this world? Tell us in the comments, because your presence here is what makes this community real. "No, Mama," Margaret said. "Nothing else." Rose, in the corridor, unfolded and refolded the cloth in her hands and felt, in the quiet of the house at 4 in the afternoon, the specific quality of a tide that had reached its highest point and was beginning slowly and without announcement to turn. Patrick arrived on Friday evening on the 6 o'clock flight from London, which landed in Accra at 11:50 at night because of the time difference and the particular indifference of transatlantic scheduling to the convenience of the people it transported. He came through arrivals with a single bag and the particular quality of a man who has made a decision and traveled toward it and has arrived at the place where the decision will be enacted, which gave his face a focused, present quality that Rose noticed immediately when she saw him come through the arrivals gate, because Madame Josephine had asked her to come to the airport and Rose had come without being asked twice. He greeted her with both hands and then held her hands for a moment longer than the greeting required and looked at her and said quietly, in the noise of the arrivals hall, "Thank you, Rose, for what you did." Rose looked at this man, 49 years old, his mother's youngest, the one who had always listened, and felt the specific quality of being seen that she had felt at the kitchen table on Tuesday morning when Madame Josephine had said that the people who love you most are not always the ones who share your name, and she received Patrick's thanks the same way she had received those words, completely, without minimizing them, without the deflection that people used when they did not know how to hold something good. "She is well," Rose said. "She has been well all week." They drove to Nkrumah Avenue through the Accra midnight, the city in its late-night configuration, quieter than the day but not quiet. The specific, reduced but persistent energy of a city that understood the night as a continuation rather than an interruption. Patrick sat in the back of the taxi and looked out the window at the city he had grown up in, and that he had been living away from for 11 years, and that received him, as it always received him, with the indifference of a place that did not require his absence or his presence, but that was simply there, continuing, which was its own form of welcome. The house on Nkrumah Avenue was lit when they arrived. Madame Josephine had left the veranda light on, and the sitting room light and the compound light, which was the configuration she used when she was expecting someone she was glad was coming. The specific illumination of welcome that Rose had seen her deploy across 14 years for guests whose arrival she was genuinely looking forward to. She was in the sitting room in her good chair. She looked up when Patrick came through the door, and Patrick stopped in the doorway for a moment and looked at his mother, at her face, her posture, the specific undiminished quality of her, and then crossed the room and bent to embrace her, and she held him with both arms and said, in Twi against his shoulder, the phrase that meant "you are here," which in Ghanaian is not merely a statement of location, but an acknowledgement of presence in the fullest sense, the confirmation that the person has arrived not just physically, but completely. They sat together for an hour, the three of them, Madame Josephine and Patrick and Rose, who had been asked to stay and had stayed, sitting in the chair that was not her spot, but that had been offered to her by Madame Josephine, with the gesture of a woman redefining in this particular evening who belonged in her sitting room. Madame Josephine told Patrick everything that had happened since Tuesday: the lawyer, the documents, the signed letter of instruction, the formal statement of her wishes, Margaret's visit on Wednesday, and the prepared presentation that had arrived and found nowhere to go. Patrick listened with the full-body attention he had used on the phone, and which was, Rose understood watching him, not a strategy or a performance, but simply who he was. A man who listened because he understood that listening was itself a form of love, that the act of receiving another person's words completely was one of the most serious gifts available in human exchange. When his mother finished, he said, "Gloria, I want to speak with her tomorrow." "I expected that," Madame Josephine said. "I told her to expect your call." "And Margaret and Ernest." He said it carefully, the way he said things that required care. "They need to know that I am here, not confrontationally, but they need to know." "Yes," his mother said. "They do." He looked at Rose. "You should be in this conversation when it happens. You are part of what has happened this week, and you should not be made invisible when the conclusion comes." Rose looked at him. She looked at Madame Josephine, who was looking back at her with the specific expression of a woman confirming a thing she had already decided. "If Madame wishes it," Rose said. "I wish it," Madame Josephine said. The meeting happened on Saturday afternoon. Gloria Asare Mensah arrived at 2 o'clock with her leather bag and her printed documents and sat at the dining room table that Madame Josephine used for occasions that required its full length, and Patrick sat beside his mother, and Rose sat at the far end, present and still, and at 2:30, Margaret and Ernest arrived together. They had been called by Patrick on Friday morning from London with the specific directness of a younger brother who had decided that the time for managing the approach was finished, and that what was needed now was the thing itself. They came in and found the table as it was arranged, and the faces around it as they were arranged, and there was a moment, brief, contained, quickly managed, where their faces did something involuntary, the specific involuntary movement of people encountering a configuration they had not prepared for, and whose implications were arriving faster than their responses could be assembled. They sat. Gloria presented the documents first, the letter of instruction, the formal statement of wishes, both dated Tuesday, both witnessed, both registered with the Law Society. She presented them in the flat, professional voice of a lawyer presenting facts that did not require interpretation because their meaning was self-evident, and she watched Margaret and Ernest receive them with the specific composure of professionals who understood what they were looking at and were choosing, in this room and at this table, not to make of the looking what they might have made of it in a different configuration. Ernest spoke first. He was a banker, and he understood documents, and he looked at the letter of instruction and the registration stamp and said, in a careful voice, "This was prepared on Tuesday." "Yes," Gloria said, 3 days ago, before Margaret's visit on Wednesday." "Yes." The table received this sequence of dates in silence. Then Patrick spoke. He spoke without anger, which was the choice he had made on the overnight flight from London, somewhere over the Sahara, when he had looked at the darkness outside the window and had decided that what this situation required from him was not the performance of righteous injury, but the actual work of addressing what had been done and what it meant, which was a different and more difficult thing. "I want to understand," he said, looking at his brother and his sister across the table. "What happened? Not what was planned. I know what was planned. I want to understand why, what you were afraid of, what you thought you needed, that you felt you could not simply ask for." Margaret looked at the table. Ernest looked at his hands. The sitting room was very quiet. Rose looked at Madame Josephine and found her looking at her two eldest children with the expression that Rose had been trying to find the right word for across the past 4 days. Not anger, not hurt, not even disappointment in its ordinary form, but the specific exhausted love of a woman who has discovered that her children were capable of this and who has decided to remain their mother anyway. Not because what they did was acceptable, but because love, at its most serious, was not a response to behavior, but a condition that preceded it. Margaret raised her eyes from the table. In them was something that Rose had not seen in 14 years of Margaret coming to this house. Not the composed, managed warmth of the visits, not the brightness of the prepared presentations, but something underneath all of that, something younger and less defended. The face of a woman who had been found out and who was, in the finding out, also finding something out about herself. "We were afraid," Margaret said. Her voice was quiet and without its usual register of authority. "Of what?" Patrick said. "Of not being enough," she said. "Of the company failing. Ernest's division has been difficult for 2 years, Patrick. 2 years of difficult quarters and a credit facility that is running out and a board that is losing patience. And my business had a bad year, a very bad year. And we looked at Mama's accounts and the house, and we thought—" She stopped. She pressed her lips together. "We thought there was a solution that was right there," Ernest said, continuing from where his sister had stopped in the way of siblings who have been finishing each other's sentences their whole lives. "And we told ourselves it was also for her benefit, that she would be safer, better cared for, that the house was too big. That is what we told ourselves," Margaret said, but it was not the truth. The table received this. Madame Josephine looked at her eldest children for a long moment. Then she said, in the voice of a woman who had decided what she was going to say and who was going to say it completely, "You should have come to me. Not with a plan, not with papers and lawyers and facilities in cantonments. You should have come to this table and sat where you are sitting now and said, 'Mama, we are struggling. We need help. That is all. Just that.'" She looked at them both. "I have money. I have a house. I have lived in this house for 40 years and I have no intention of leaving it. But I also have 2 children who are in difficulty and who did not trust me enough to tell me. And that, not the plan, not the documents, not any of it, that is what hurts me." The table was very still. Margaret's eyes were wet. Ernest was looking at his mother with the expression of a man receiving a reproach that is also, unmistakably, a declaration of love, which was the most disorienting kind of reproach and the most necessary. Gloria quietly organized her documents and put them in her bag and looked at Patrick, who gave her the slight nod of a man indicating that the legal portion of the afternoon had concluded and what remained was not her territory, which she received and acknowledged with the professional grace of a lawyer who understood the difference between a legal problem and a human one and knew which one she had been hired to address. She excused herself, and Rose walked her to the gate, and on the way through the compound, Gloria said, without stopping, "Your madam is remarkable." "Yes," Rose said. "She is." "So are you," Gloria said, and went through the gate before Rose could respond, which was perhaps the right way to say a thing like that. Rose stood in the compound in the early evening light and looked at the single tree and the main house with its windows lit from inside, the warm rectangles of light that meant people were in the rooms and the rooms were inhabited, and the house was doing what houses were built to do, which was to hold the lives of the people inside them against the indifference of everything outside. She thought about Tuesday morning and the groundnut oil and the pantry window and the cold cup of tea she had left on the kitchen counter when she went to look through the gap in the curtain, the cold cup that was still there on the counter when she came back. which she had poured away and replaced with a hot one because that was what she did and what she would continue to do. The small, faithful, unremarkable acts of care that held a life together when the larger things threatened to come apart. Inside the house, at the dining room table, Madame Josephine was speaking to her children. Rose could not hear the words, but she could see through the window the quality of the room. The way the four of them were sitting, the specific configuration of a family that has passed through something difficult and has arrived, not without cost, on the other side of it, still together. She went back inside. She went to the kitchen and began to prepare the evening meal because it was evening, and there were people in the house, and people needed to be fed, which was the oldest and most honest form of love available in a kitchen, and which Rose Akimpong Darko had been offering faithfully in this house for 14 years, and intended to continue offering for as long as she was needed, which she understood in the way that she understood most important things, quietly, completely, without requiring anyone to say it out loud, would be for a very long time yet. And as the elders have always said, the hand that stirs the pot in the dark is the hand that holds the family together in the light. Share this story right now with someone you love. Subscribe to this channel and hit that like button and help us reach 5,000 subscribers. We are almost there, and every single one of you is the reason these stories keep being told. Are you watching from Accra, Lagos, London, Toronto, Nairobi, Johannesburg, or somewhere else in this beautiful world? Drop your country in the comments below, because your presence here is what makes this community real. The house on Nkrumah Avenue stood as it had always stood. The compound tree held its evening birds. And Rose Akimpong Darko stood at the stove in the kitchen that smelled of groundnut oil and wood smoke and 40 years of meals made with love, and she cooked, and the cooking was enough, and the enough was everything.